Hi everyone, my name's Resham Kotecha. I'm Global Head of Policy at the Open Data Institute, and I have the pleasure and privilege of chairing this panel, which is about how we can use open data to tackle the cost of living crisis. I'm delighted to be joined by two brilliant speakers, Alessandro Nicoletti from Centrepoint and Salman Klar from the Richmond and Wandsworth Council. I'll sit down now, but hopefully you can see us and hear us. Let us know if not, just being blinded here. But we're talking today about how we can use data to tackle the cost of living crisis. And over the course of the session, we'll be tackling elements and questions such as, when we talk about opening data sets, what are we talking about and for whom? There's a cost associated with opening, using and maintaining data sets, so I'd love us to get into that a little bit. There's also lots of data sets that are open and perhaps not being used to the best of their ability or not being publicized in a way that means people are able to access and use them. We'll also cover issues such as inconsistencies in definitions, time lags in data collection, and the challenge of maintaining data that can change quite quickly. There's also a risk, a political risk and a financial risk of opening data sets, which ties into why some data sets are not opened. And we'll be looking and talking about accountability of those collecting, holding and using data, as well as the long-term planning and strategy. So we at the Open Data Institute strongly believe in the power of data to benefit people in their daily lives and to inform better policy making. We actually worked on a flagship story that Centrepoint very kindly assisted us with at the end of last year. You're welcome to read it. It's on our website, that looked at cost of living crisis. And we looked across 4 key measures: housing, debt, food, and fuel. And what we recognized as through that report, and I hope you will take some time to read it, it's a very easy read, is that combining the data sets across those 4 measures really helps us to see the disproportionate impact that the cost of living crisis has on certain groups. So, for example, we don't often think about the fact that younger households might really struggle, but we found that households where the head of the household was under 25 disproportionately suffered from all of these issues: food poverty, fuel poverty, rising debt, and homelessness issues. There's also data challenges we found. So current data is siloed. So when you look at these individual data sets, you're able to see that different cohorts, different groups of people across the country have challenges. But it's very difficult to bring those data sets together because of differences in definitions, differences in the way we collect that data and use it, and the way in which we update it, that makes it hard for us to truly see the impact on people around the UK. The differing definitions between the 4 nation states mean we also miss people, as well as definitions, and I know you'll be talking about some of the Centrepoint challenges in actually collecting homelessness numbers. And as I've touched on, key data sets are often out of date or have a significant time lag. So as part of that, we see that there's a cohort of hidden homelessness where people are not counted if they're sleeping on buses, for example, or if they're not immediately ready to bed down. And we saw that with fuel statistics, over 3.5 million households are living in fuel poverty, but are not counted on the official government statistics. So please do have a look for more context. It's a flagship story and a cost of living crisis that we're really proud to have worked on and to have highlighted some of the key challenges that we think need to be dealt with. And I'm hoping that my 2 brilliant speakers, and I'll be handing over to them, will be able to share some of their experiences and thoughts on how we can use open data to tackle the cost of living. So I'll start immediately to my left. Alessandro, if I could ask you to introduce yourself and a few minutes on your work.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here, and to the Open Data Institute, of course, for inviting me to speak here. My name is Alessandro Nicoletti. I work as a researcher at Centrepoint, which is a national youth homelessness charity. And we have been active for more than 50 years in supporting young people aged 16 to 25 when they face homelessness. And in particular, at the moment, we are supporting more than 16,000 young people every single year, providing accommodation, support, that could be in terms of course, psychological support, health support, helping them in finding employment, and then as well as trying to help them moving on after they're being for a period with us. And in terms of data, of course, we know there has been a very meaningful research from the Office of National Statistics looking at hidden homelessness, which I think is a key issue in this matter. Because, of course, while we talk about homelessness, the immediate idea we have is of someone rough sleeping. However, there is many more that are actually, that can be considered homeless while not sleeping rough in the streets. And so it's important to highlight there are a few categories that have been identified by the Office of National Statistics that are more at risk of falling in this what is called hidden homelessness. And this includes, of course, young people. That's because, of course, they rely on informal networks a lot, and so they might be sofa surfing, sleeping at a friend, like going from a house to another house, and not really approaching, their council or like asking for support. However, they're still facing the same challenges. They don't have a roof over their heads, and they might be, of course, also in poverty as well. And so at Centerpoint, we try to estimate every year the number of young people that might be facing homelessness. Last year, we estimated that 136,000 young people faced homelessness in the UK, an 8% increase compared to the previous year. So, of course, we can see the impact that the cost of living had on young people. And it's important to highlight, how do we collect this data? How do we get this information? Of course, we know there are many statistics that are published on homelessness by the government. However, there are huge gaps, especially when you look at age disaggregation and age disaggregated data, which is, of course, for us is key. And so because we cannot find this data publicly available online, we really have to rely on freedom of information requests, which is it's very good for us that, because of that, we can access information that is hold at council levels, but otherwise it wouldn't be published on government websites. So thanks to that, we managed to collect information from all the councils across the country and draw a more accurate picture of what the current situation is. So yeah, these are my initial remarks, but of course, I'm open to answer any question later on.
Wonderful. Thank you for those introductory remarks. We'll definitely come back for some follow-up questions, and I will keep time for audience questions, so please do start thinking about what you'd like to hear from these two gentlemen. But Salman, thank you so much. If you could give us 3 minutes.
Morning, everyone. So my name is Salman Kalar. I work for London boroughs of Richmond and Wandsworth. Are there any local residents here? We're on the other side of the borough? Okay, great. Okay, well, there's one. So I can't help you with parking if you can ask me about that. So between these two boroughs, we have 500,000 residents in London. And I think everybody here probably is sold on the value of open data. We're all beneficiaries of open data. You probably all use some sort of an app to get here that relied on a lot of that open data, mapping data, transport data to get you here. You're probably going to use it to go back home. So, and I'm going to restrict my remarks to open data, obviously, from government and public bodies. I'm not really going to get into, private sector. So we have a lot of data. Government collects a lot of data as part of service delivery. So why is data not open? Why can't anybody just access it? Why does Alessandro have to struggle so much to get access to some of this information? It's because I think one of the things to remember is you can't just open data. You can't just have it available. There's cost associated with opening data. Someone has to analyze it. Someone has to cleanse it. Someone has to make sure it complies with legislation. Someone has to, put it somewhere, communicate about it, and then be able to deal with the follow-up questions that come with open data. So that's just on the technical and resource side. But the other thing is most public bodies have big P or small p politics attached to them. And opening information can have political costs, and that's something to keep in mind, that it really does come down to, the policy structures that have been put in place that enable or sometimes hinder open data. So I think, and sometimes, public bodies do struggle making information widely open because they might be worried about, what are people going to say about when they are looking under the hood. So that's one of the things to think about. But coming to cost of living, so if you think about the cost of living crisis, which came right at the back of COVID, and there was two very different data environments. So COVID, I'm sure a lot of you were aware of the government COVID website. Everyone's going, refreshing it, checking it every day. So why is it that there's lots of information coming for COVID, but not really coming for cost of living? There's not as much focus on the data side or just on generally on the response side. Why was there lots of companies were even making their data available to kind of track mobility and stuff to see what the impact of restrictions was? I think one of the things probably is that a lot of people in this room, I'm sure, weren't as impacted by cost of living. We're in one of the most affluent parts of one of the most affluent cities as we were by COVID. So while we say, everyone was together in COVID, the reality of it, we weren't all together in cost of living. Some people are impacted more, and it is harder to find information on them. From a local government's perspective, we use a lot of information. We rely on a lot of information from central government departments to be able to do our job, to deliver direct services to individuals. And that information obviously cannot be made open. And a lot of times, I think our voluntary sector colleagues struggle with us because they will want information. They want to understand, poverty statistics at a very local level, and we cannot give it to them because it's not our information. We have to rely on someone else to give it to us, and they make us sign agreements that say otherwise that we cannot share it. The other is, if anyone watches the news, your local council is struggling. Your local council's budgets are very, very tight. And you know what's kind of making councils go bankrupt? Homelessness. And not even the rough sleeping or street homelessness you see. It's families. It's families with children, it's people with disabilities who cannot afford private sector houses. These people, in a vast majority of the cases, have jobs. And that puts a huge strain on our resources. So when you have a council or a public body that has to do their bread and butter of every day versus opening things like opening data, the choice for us is the person who's outside our front door sleeping on the street, right? Because that's what we would prioritize. But that's not to say that there's not a lot more that can be done with open data. I think part of the reason, and I think I'll be honest about our organization and other public bodies, we do need a culture of openness around data, and that if we are far from it, we are not there yet.
Thank you so much. So two really fascinating introductions there and insights into the work you do and the challenges you face. And I think what's particularly interesting that's come out from both of you is the cost to both your organisations and the resources you have to expend on getting access to data and information that you're either unable to share because it's not your own data or that you have to FOI to be able to get access to it. So in the work we did in our story on the cost of living, we came up with some recommendations, and I'd love to hear some of yours on what we could actually do to encourage that culture of openness. I mean, we talked about the need for publishing a cost of living index that was categorized by age, gender, ethnicity, and geography, standardizing and expanding geographical coverage, the need for more granular data, the need for data standards and data literacy. And anyone familiar with the ODI's work will know those two things we really care about. And really, as you said, that culture of open data. And I think that understanding amongst the population that, yes, that data collection and standardization and assurance is costly, but actually it's a short-term cost that will allow us to save in the long term because we could be more impactful. So those are some of our kind of asks or recommendations. If you two had magic wands, Salman, I'll start with you this time. If you could do something, magic wand, other than a magic money tree, what would your ask to central government or to people in general from a culture point of view be that would help you in your role and your council to deliver better services through data?
I think our ask could slightly be different. We need to know who the person is. Because for us, it's very difficult to help someone unless we don't know, because otherwise it causes delays. I think from open data, I'll give you examples of a few open data sources that have been immensely valuable for us. One is EPC. I think if anybody rents, you probably have bought a house, you probably come across it. So we very quickly were able to kind of combine EPC data with our benefits data to figure out people who had low EPC, but also, were on benefits, so were struggling with income. But we need a lot more because there's a huge proportions of our population that we do not know their financial circumstances. So that's one of the things we kind of constantly try and work with central government on it. But I think from a government point of view, thinking about it, I think data sort of has to be open at source. I think it's going to 300 councils to get information is not really, a valid way of doing things. That information is provided to those departments that central government departments as part of compliance. And it sort of does have to be opened at source. And the other thing is, a lot of people who are working in cost of living do not have the resources to do massive data cleanses. So it does have to be in sort of a consistent format. There needs to be some quality to it. There needs to be some, metadata attached with it that kind of helps you explain it. If you need to have a long conversation with someone about an open data set, is it open data then? So I think that's one of the things I think would be helpful, more consistency at least.
And just before, Alessandra, you give us your magic wishes, I mean, in our cost of living report, the government statistics on fuel poverty don't count houses with an EPC score of C or higher, but actually 53% of low-income households live in houses with a rating of EPC C or higher. So that's where we come to the 3.6 million households that aren't actually collected. But we know from the work we've done that many of those households live in fuel poverty. But if we don't know who they are, then government, local government, charities, community groups cannot actually get help to the people that need it. So Alessandra, your magic wishes now.
Yeah, thanks. I think I'm going to touch upon points that you both mentioned, and I'd say definitely for us is seeing how different departments within the government and then across the foreign nations, huge differences in how much data is actually shared online and is publicly available. I'm just going to give you an example, for instance, while it's very difficult to access data on homelessness, then if you look at the Department for Work and Pension, they have an amazing portal. Data is easily accessible to check data on benefits levels, on any other information that they have that they collect, and so really seeing these differences across departments of within the same government, and then seeing the differences across the foreign nations. As I said, in England we really have to rely on sending freedom of information requests to all the 300 councils in England, whereas when we go talking with the devolved government in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, you just send an email to the main office, to the main statistics office, or even in Wales, in the case of Welsh, data is actually already available and published online every year. So really, I think creating a sort of consistency across all government levels and having data that is published, of course, when it's possible, and when, of course, you're not entangling privacy or other key issues. I think it's very important for everyone to understand what's going on. For us working in charities, of course, to advocate for the rights of the people we're trying to support, and then in general as well for researchers as well.
It's really fascinating from both of you. And in terms of the work you're doing, are there you've spoken about the difference between our four nations. Are there other countries, are there other groups, charities, organizations that you see who are really using open data effectively and leveraging that access to be able to tackle cost of living or any other sort of issues?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if we just talk about the homelessness sector, of course, we are not the only ones that do research and try to, of course, to understand what's the current state of youth homelessness in our case. But of course, if you talk about bigger charities like Crisis or Shelter, they all do their publications using, of course, government data, which, as I said, I think the issue for us is much more. It's relying much more on the fact that we need age disaggregated data for our purpose, but for them it's probably easier to actually access the data and work on more meaningful analysis. Another partner that we have that I want to mention as well is Land 8. They've done a very good analysis on affordability, house affordability, which is something you wouldn't. Of course, it's not an indicator you would find on on government websites, but then, using different data sources that are publicly available, then you're able to create these sort of indicators, which creates a very meaningful and very accurate analysis to understand how then the housing crisis in general and how the cost of living, of course, had impact on the affordability as well of housing.
Thank you. And Salman, before I hand over to the audience for questions, you talked about central government data that you're unable to share because of the agreements signed. Are there any data sets you can think of in particular where you think if we had the ability to share this, it would enable us to really kind of level up the work we're doing, to get it to the next level, to be able to share that with partners on the ground, community groups, charities, that would really help your residents? Is there anything you can think of that you'd love government to not make you sign?
I think it's a lot of it is around benefits, so like helping developing the benefits picture. We don't have the full benefits picture because we only have access to data that we administer in terms of benefits, which if anyone's familiar with benefits, it's mostly housing benefit and council tax reductions. The biggest one, which is now universal credit, we actually don't know which of our residents are on universal credit. So I think that if we can kind of enable the sharing of that information more, that would really help our, voluntary and community sector organizations that do very micro level work, because a lot of these organizations are very small. They're dealing with a ward or a neighborhood. They're not really, large organizations that have their own analysts and stuff, and they can crunch data or deal with agreements and stuff. They just need to know where they need to go and act. And I think just being able to kind of answer those questions directly for them would be helpful. I think that the thing that Alessandro mentioned in terms of Stat Explore, that's really good if you have analysts. If you don't, I think you would struggle to kind of make sense of that information.
Amazing, thank you. Right, so I promised time for audience questions. If you have a question, pop your hand up and we'll come to you. Oh, okay. And if you could just say your name, where you're from, but keep it to the question, just so that if we get enough time for everyone, that would be great.
Okay. Oh, my name is Max Coote. I'm a journalist. I was just intrigued by Salman's said that the biggest problem we have is an open. We need an open culture. Who do you think should drive that open culture? Should that come from the government? Should that come from the chief executives of your council? Should that come from your data gatherers? Or should it come from the general public putting pressure for that openness?
I think it's like any other culture change. I think one person or a group of people can't do it. It does have to come from everybody else. And I'll speak for my own community's analyst community needs to step up and say, this is how we can make it open. Because, a minister of chief exec are not data analysts. They're not sitting around crunching data. So they need to know, they need to be enabled by their data governance people and analysts to say, this is how you can share this information openly, credibly, securely, while being in compliance with the legislation that governs your work. So I'm not going to point my finger at anybody else and say, I think we as analysts and op council officers should start that process and help those decision makers.
Is that something you do now?
Yeah, quite a bit. We have two open data portals, datarich.info and dataone.info if you want to check out. So we try and make public data available for our local communities.
And it's a great question. Our view at the ODI is that actually this needs to come from everyone and everywhere. We talk a lot about the need for data literacy amongst the general public, because if you understand what the data can do for you, you're more likely to support the collection, the use, the opening. You want to trust that your data will be safe and that it's used for your benefit, not just for the benefit of private companies. But we also think it's really important for that to come from government and for the politicians, policymakers, those who work in central and devolved governments to actually also have the data literacy. That means you don't have to be the data analyst or the data scientist. You can be the chief exec, you can be the prime minister, you can be the head of a government department and actually understand how to do that well, how to have the data assurance, have that culture around open data in a way that means you minimize the costs and maximize the benefits whilst engendering a culture of trust and transparency. Any other questions? Oh, we'll take at the front here and then at the front there, if that's okay. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you. Hi, Sophia. I work at Google in our open source programs office, and as a researcher, where I really enjoy the access of public information. I use it a lot in my work. And the more you're talking, we're at an open source conference, and I can't not think about the benefit that all of us experience in the broader community and the uplift that community and volunteers, both paid and on their own volition, bring to our ability to problem solve collectively. And it sounds like a lot of the challenges you're talking about are happening prior to the release of the data itself. It sounds like that's the hardest part. And there's a lot of just raw data analytical challenges beyond compliance that I think about myself and many others that our analysts in this community would love to help with. And I'm just wondering if there's another way that we can think about leveraging the power of community and the people that want to help bring the data to the people that can use it, that are both the analysts as well as the people that can help with data engineering and some of these other technical challenges. And I know it's really challenging because, again, like there's a lot of compliance and privacy and regulatory issues, but is there an opportunity to leverage community earlier in this process to help accelerate and sort of bring more people to the problem?
How would you bring more people to the problem?
Well, I'd say, of course, we try to have, I'm going to say, we have daily conversations with government departments, to be honest, about the access to data. And we're also trying to bring, we have like a network of partner organizations that might be, as was mentioned, there are many smaller organizations that in the voluntary sector that work on homelessness, and it could be really a local organization working in a specific area in Richmond. And so we try to bring them all together and present the interest of their interest and and how they would benefit from accessing more data. So, and we try then to represent them in these conversations then directly with government departments. And as I said, we really have weekly conversations with people that are behind the data that is being published, and trying to present this interest and the benefits that would bring to our, let's say, to the voluntary sector and to the charities community in accessing this data, so we are better positioned to advocate for the young people that we try to support. So I think that's a way you can try to bring and involve more people in advocating for more open data.
Yeah, I think from a local government's perspective, we're not in the job of knowledge creation because we simply do not have the capacity. Also, we deal with lots of issues at the same time. And we really do rely on, researchers and academics and, voluntary sector to kind of look at if the policies that are happening, are they actually working, to say what should be done. And that kind of drive, a lot of times, does come from outside government. And this is where I think having more and more open data would help, particularly when you can have a comprehensive understanding of issue like homelessness or poverty. Poverty, for example, is very difficult to define. So are we even using the right type of language and right type of data when we're kind of defining it? So the more we can open it, I think the more we can have ideas around how to solve those very, very complex issues.
And I'd say, just to add, the ODI is a civil society organisation. We're a not-for-profit. We work in partnership with many other organisations, governments around the world, private sector organisations, charities, community groups. And actually, the more we involve civil society, you'll always get different people saying it's not your job to do the knowledge creation. You have primary purpose. And actually, there are plenty of organisations who work very hard on this. The challenge is, where do the resources come from? And you can only be as effective and impactful as the resources you have. So we think it's really important to partner with organisations so that we can actually get that message across, whether it's policymakers, whether it's community groups, and actually upskilling communities to understand this is why you should be asking for data to be open. This is what it can do. And if you're concerned about homelessness, well, that's great. There's lots of data out there, and you could lobby and petition and campaign for that to be open. And similarly, with every issue there is, more often than not, there's data to help. But we also need the public to understand where that data is, like what is data? And so we work very hard to upskill people on that, because you can't start a campaign to open data if people aren't aware what data actually is, where it comes from, and how it can be helped. We had a final question up here at the front.
Thank you. Joe Leach from Tower Hamlets. First of all, big thanks to Salman for opening up a few data sets. We do use some of your outlets regularly, so thank you. And then in relation to FOI, I thought that was quite interesting, because at the moment there are some data sets which are open by statute. So we have to publish payments over a certain threshold, and we have to publish details of salaries for senior post holders. But beyond that, there aren't that many guidelines over what makes a good open data set. There's a very nice paper by the Oxford Internet Institute, it's a few years old now, about what are the determinants of what makes a good open data set. Historically, it's been driven by commerce and their needs, but there is also a lot of talk about what other organisations need as well. And so your example of trying to get FOI information is quite interesting, because our information governance team have a lot of problems with FOI. They tend to get the same FOIs repeatedly, and actually that's a good way of deciding what makes a good open data set, is where you're constantly being bombarded with requests for the same thing. And now they even have tools to recognize a request for something that's been previously provided and then simply signpost the people to that data set. So yeah, I think there are some ideas around about which things should be opened up, but then then comes the question of how, and Salman mentioned this as well, is I suppose the question is, how did you find the variability of the data quality?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, and yeah, there is a huge variability as well that we find in when we send. Of course, if we send like FOIs to 300 councils, you're gonna receive 300 different answers, and then that's basically my job done in putting them together and make sense out of it. But yeah, there is a huge variability in the answers we receive, but they tend to be of good quality, and also the response rate is quite high. We got last year, I think it's 89% response rate from our freedom of information requests. So I think it's also like doing it over and over the years. We have created like a better request and making sure that we receive like a complete answer response to our requests, and making sure that. That we receive the data that we want, but also, of course, there are many issues when you try to ask for an FOI request. There is some data they might not want to publish, especially we are talking as well about like 16 to 25. There are some issues, of course, with data for under 18s. But apart from sending the freedom of information request, we also try to have conversations with people in the councils when we see there might be issues with our requests, and trying to understand what could be a good compromise in accessing some particular data that might not want to share it, and what we can maybe change in our request, making sure that they can provide an answer.
I think FOIs, I think at least we have a backup system that kind of helps open data. I think it's part of democracy. I think it's part of citizens should be able to know, what public bodies do with your information and, how it's used and stuff. But just from an open data point of view, if you think about the resource that goes into 300 councils, some of which might be, talking tens of thousands of people, some councils a million, Birmingham is over 1 million. So the resources that are going to go across 300 councils, plus the resources going to go in by center point to kind of gather that information, that's a huge waste of resource. So I think this is why I think the thing you mentioned, it's very good to look at your FOIs and see what's already people are asking again and again. One of the things I really do wish people would look at on our website before they make an FOI request is the contracts register. We get so many FOIs by tech companies. I'm not picking at anyone, but small tech companies just wanting to know who we're buying from and what we're buying from, and all councils have to publicly declare it. So I think so clearly there's work to be done, maybe even improving that. So I think resource can be saved by people who are trying to gather that information and provide that information.
Right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but please do check out the resources that Salman's talked about from their council. Please do look at the great work Centrepoint's doing, and please do have a look at the ODI's cost of living report from the end of last year, because it's got so much in there. I hope you'll join me in thanking our two brilliant speakers today, and thank you for being such a brilliant audience.